Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Wernher Ovalle. I wanted to present some information to those interested on ivermectin. You may know it as the horse dewormer. But I've been researching this over the past month and have come to some surprising findings and conclusions of which I thought it's worthwhile to share with other people. And so if you're inclined to want to know a little bit more about this on a deeper level as to what the data really is saying about ivermectin, then this video may well be for you. Um, Quick word about me. I'm 22 years now board certified internist. I went to UC San Diego for medical school, University of Washington, Seattle for residency, and I've been in private practice since then. I am big on evidence-based medicine. I am not an anti-vaxxer, and I highly recommend the vaccines. So the game plan will be we're going to spend a couple minutes just going over some basics on how to read a study and what the issues are there. I promise I will not bore you. It will be very succinct and targeted. We're going to talk about the data that's against ivermectin, the data in favor of ivermectin, some safety issues if they exist, and what is the government thinking and saying about this. And then we'll cap it off with some of my brilliant recommendations. Okay, so let's talk about study basics. And its most basic level, what we're talking about is there's some kind of intervention in a study that causes an effect. And what we're always trying to figure out if that was really a causal relationship, or was it just by coincidence that we saw this? So as an example, here's Johnny, and he's about 1% height for his class. And we are going to give Johnny dun 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 Talotab. Talotab is going to hopefully help him grow. And here he is a month later. Apparently it seems like Talotab has helped Johnny. Okay, so the question is, now that we see in the study that Talotab seemed to cause growth, the issue always is going to be, was that really because of the Talotab? What is the chance that maybe he was going to have a growth spurt just when we did the study, or there's some other thing we didn't think of, right? And that it really wasn't due to the Talotab. And that percent is always kind of what we're trying to figure out in this study, what's real and what may not be real. So in this instance, let's say 5%. Let's say it's 5% chance that it was due to something else. And 95% chance that it was actually due to the Talotab. Well, as it turns out, we can live with that as scientists, and that's actually what we always are going for, something at about this rate, because that's pretty, that's pretty convincing. If it's 95%, Talotab, and it's this pretty small percentage that it's not, we can live with that. And we write this as what's called a p-value, and you're certainly going to see this in this talk, but p-value. And so a p-value of 0.05, it's very simple. You just look at it, and now you're going to know what that means. It's a 5% chance of it being due to something else aside from, the thing you're testing for in the study. In this case, Talotab. Now, if this number was even smaller, like 0.001, that's, 1/1000th of a chance that it's going to be due to something else is very convincing. That means it's 99.999% chance that what you're looking at is a Talotab effect. So the smaller this number is, the better. Now, conversely, if the number was greater, like let's say it's 0.1 or 0.3, then the study starts to lose more and more statistical strength. But we're always chasing this. And here we are climbing the proverbial research mountain, the steep mountain, and trying to reach this magical number of 0.05. So you can do a study and work for 6 months on it or a year, and you get your results, and it's p equals 0.06, and you have not reached statistical significance. Your data, therefore, is interesting. Your data may show trends. It may justify future studies, but what it isn't, it's not statistically significant, and from that vantage point, we cannot hang our hat on this to really say much about it. Now, once we do reach this, we can definitely draw conclusions from it. Next is power. This is actually a very simple but an extremely important concept. And usually when people figure out the power of a study. They do it before they actually start the study. And what it means is it's basically the question, what is the likelihood that a study is able to find a difference between groups if it in fact does exist? So let's imagine that Talotab actually does increase growth. And the question is, how do we design a study strong enough to pick up that difference? And this could largely be determined, by number of people in a study, among other factors. But you're trying to design that study so it's strong enough to pick it up, assuming it does exist. So if a power is 10% in a study, which is dismal, then even if it does exist, probably not going to find it, the relationship, okay? At 60% it's better. Maybe it's a 50-50 proposition there if the group is going to be able to successfully describe it. But at 90%, then yes, that's a well-powered study. If a relationship does in fact exist between Talotab and growth, for instance, we're probably going to be able to find it through this study the way it was designed. It's properly powered. And now we get to this question here, is how can we potentially use power to fool people, if you will? I'm going to give you an example here. Let's say I hate wearing car seatbelts for whatever reason. I don't know why. Maybe they're tight on me or something. And the ideal is, can I use the things that we just spoke about to design a study so I don't have to wear them anymore? The answer is yes, I could. Series of steps. Number one, my hypothesis that I'm going to set for my study is opposite of what I'm trying to do. So in this case, it's seatbelts save lives. Okay? So I'm actually going to set up a study opposite of what I want. And I'm going to intentionally lower the power on that study such that it doesn't have a chance in heck of being able to find that relationship. So below 10, maybe it's 5, maybe the power is 3. So that means this study has a 3% chance of describing this difference, even though we all know it actually, seatbelts do save lives, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 12 people. That's a very low number, and I'm doing that intentionally. 12 people to wear the seatbelts for a week in the cars, and I'm going to take 12 and tell them not to wear seatbelts for 1 week. And oh my God, nothing happens. No one dies. So because there was no difference between the two groups, deaths in the seatbelt group were 0 and deaths in the no seatbelt group was 0, that means there was no statistical significance level reached in terms of a difference between groups. Now, there are 2 ways I can write the conclusions to this study. One is earnest and the other diabolical. So here is the earnest conclusion. This study did not have the proper power to make any determination in respects to seatbelt safety. And that is I call it earnest, honest, true way to describe the results of that study. The diabolical way is to say this. The study shows automobile seatbelts made no difference in saving lives. Okay, so wow. That's a pretty bold statement. But in fact, that's what happened. You had 2 groups and there was no difference, right? So I could potentially describe the results this way. And I say diabolical because it's very misleading, because you as a researcher know you did not have this adequately powered. And there was no way in heck that your study was going to find that relationship. But yet here you are making this bold claim. So what happens is, unfortunately, what I can do now is I can send this conclusion off to the newspaper, and they're off and running. They run seatbelts don't work. And before long, you're going to see it on TV. Study shows seatbelts no longer effective. You see this pundit saying, hey, we don't need seatbelts anymore. And this guy's saying, hey, have to follow the science. Good work. And this brings this point up about following the science. I hear that a lot. But there's good science and bad science, and great science. And just like every other discipline in life, there's good versions of it, and then there's not so good versions of it, right? So this is kind of a silly statement to make, actually. Now, if someone at the table was, had the aptitude enough to say, hey, Bob, would you happen to know if that study was properly powered? That's the right question to ask. I've yet to hear that ever asked in any of these presentations, but the issue is he would have to say, well, actually, yeah, the power of the study was 3, which makes the study a joke. It makes it completely meaningless, actually. The other thing that we can do to fool people, just real briefly, and then we'll get on with it, is meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is where you have a research group select a number of studies, put them together, and compile them, and tries to make it stronger because you have a bigger number of participants. So let's say there's 20 studies. These are the identical thing copied here, but let's say that there's 20 here and the researchers end up picking 6. You can see, depending on the 6 that they pick, they can really determine kind of, because what this is going to be reflecting. So this is more blue. You can see it's more blue, but yet these researchers are making it look like it's all peach. And these researchers are making it look like it's completely blue. And it's also possible that you can have 2 research teams, selecting and having completely different options. Now, what happens is that the bias of the research group increases the more selective they are, right? If they just did all of them, then it would minimize their bias. Okay, so let's talk about that data against ivermectin. We're going to start off with the New York Times, which they commented on this review that was published. That was by Dr. Maria Popp, and we're going to get to her meta-analysis in about 5 minutes. But she looked at 14 studies, and we're going to look at them real briefly. But the New York Times points out that not one of these studies, not one of them provided evidence of the drug's ability to prevent COVID or reduce mortality. So let's look at the first 5 studies here. In the Shakur study, there was 12 and 12, 16, 19, 25, 25, 36, 37, 20. So you could see these are the number of people in the studies. The Lopez Medina had a little more. And there was no difference pretty much in any of these outcomes, whether it was, symptoms at day 7, hospital days, testing. The Lopez Medina one, actually, which we're going to talk about in more detail in a second, favored ivermectin in many ways. Okay, but that said, did not reach statistical significance. So let's start with these 5 studies. The issue here has to do with power. The power in each of these studies was less than 10 and as low as 3. These are like car seat belt studies. Okay, that's what they all are. But we can kind of get at that a little more by looking at their conclusions. What kind of conclusion between the 2 that we looked at? Was it the one that was kind of modest and honest, admitting that our studies did not have proper power and we really can't say? Or was it the other kind of conclusion where they were way ahead of their skis, saying that that they had figured out that there was no significant effect of the seatbelts, or in this case would be ivermectin? So let's look at the conclusions. One says, among patients, there was no difference in the PCR positives. Ivermectin did not increase the number of stays, respiratory deterioration, or deaths, period. That's it. The findings do not support the use of ivermectin for treatment of mild COVID. In each of these studies, as you see, it was very overstated what the results kind of showed, in other words. And it's because it's basically a joke that this study can say this with a power, this particular study, of 6. So understanding how studies work, you would understand that this conclusion is actually quite laughable. But that aside, I want to take a look at the Lopez Medina study. This got published in JAMA. And the reason I want to look at it is because it actually had more people in it than the others. The others had like 12 people, which is crazy low. It's almost the size of a kindergarten class. But this one at least had 200, so it was a little bit more sizable. But the problem with this study, which should never have been published in JAMA, I would never have published this or even thought to publish because in the disclosure here of Dr. Lopez Medina, during the study was receiving money from all of the drug makers, from vaccine makers, from Merck, Glaxo, Janssen, Santa Fe. Like he was actively receiving money during the study. And that is a complete conflict of interest. We're going to get into this a little bit, but ivermectin certainly presents a bit of a risk to the vaccine companies because it threatens to take basically business away from them. So they have no interest in seeing ivermectin succeed. And the bias really bleeds out when you actually look at the study. In the Lopez Medina trial, if you look at the ivermectin versus placebo, in 7 out of the 8 measures, ivermectin did better. So people got better quicker, their symptoms improved, faster. There was less fever, and on and on. The only one that placebo did better was if they went to the ICU, which happened less with ivermectin, but if they did, they were there longer. Okay, so 7 out of the 8 outcome measures were in favor of ivermectin. It did not reach statistical significance, though, because it had an extremely low power. You can see here's the p-value. So, he concludes the findings do not support the use of ivermectin, period. This is a biased way to interpret this. Anyone else who is being fair would say that ivermectin shows promise, but our study was underpowered to reach statistical significance. But again, this is probably the result of undue bias because he's receiving funds actively from vaccine companies during the trial. So anyways, but those are the first 5. The next 4, interestingly enough, all are in favor of ivermectin. But the problem is there's only 300 patients between these 4. Again, same issue that we had here. It's a low power. You can't really say either way. So it's interesting, and we can maybe look at it for trend, but in and of themselves are not great studies because they just have too low of numbers. They're not really properly powered. Now, the next 4 are the ones that actually reached the magic of statistical significance, and they are good studies. They're very well done studies. Ivermectin clears virus faster in the Bukhari. In the Ahmad trial, ivermectin patients got discharged sooner. The Ravkirti study, which I particularly like, showed mortality benefit of 0.019, so it did improve mortality as compared to placebo. In Schumann, it prevented getting COVID to the highly statistical less than 0.001. Out of the 14, this was the only study that they included that looked at prophylaxis, like basically taking ivermectin like regularly to prevent COVID. So taken all together, if I was to do my own meta-analysis, this is kind of what I would say. That there were 10 studies which are difficult to really even compare because they all had different outcomes. One would be looking at viral load, the other one would be looking at time in the hospital, and so on. So it's more of a qualitative versus a quantitative meta-analysis because the studies were so different. But that said, I'd say that there were 10 that were grossly underpowered. So you really can't say much about them. 4 in favor of placebo, 6 in favor of ivermectin. But again, doesn't mean a whole bunch. And then there was actually 4 good studies that did reach statistical significance. And these are the ones from which we can sort of garnish some kind of further understanding about ivermectin, that it cleared virus faster. It actually helped patients get home sooner to this, and it did prevent deaths to this, and it helped prevent contraction of COVID, highly statistically significant. So, overall, a pretty rosy picture is painted here in favor of ivermectin, if anything else. Hard to dispute that. But let's look again at what the New York Times said, because now this isn't making sense. They said that out of 14, that not one, all of them, none of them provided any sort of evidence that the drug could help improve patients' condition, reduce mortality, or prevent people from getting COVID. So that is completely at odds with what we just reviewed. So this is a misstatement, of course. But let's take a look at Maria Pop's review and see how do we get to this. So let's look at the actual meta-analysis of Maria Popp, and let's look at specifically the mortality benefit, because this one strikes me, because there was really primarily, there was a couple studies that looked at mortality, but the Ravkirti trial was the only one that actually had that as one of their primary outcome measures, and it showed statistical significance. But yet, her conclusion was ivermectin showed no evidence of any effect on mortality. How can this be? The one study she had in there looking at mortality was statistically significant. As well, going through this study of hers, and kind of buried in there was this bizarre explanation that the authors literally removed the Ravkirti trial because, quote unquote, it performed an inappropriate analysis. Okay, so that's completely bogus and bizarre. Why would you include this study in your meta-analysis if it was performing inappropriate analyses to begin with? And they don't explain what that is. So it sounds highly artificial. And then when it came to the prevention piece, she concludes one of the 14 studies did investigate this, but we didn't include it because it did not report results free of high risk of bias. So I actually looked at the entire study, the Ravkirti's trial, and I don't know what bias she's talking about. She doesn't specify here. Highly subjective, but just decides to take it out. Because apparently, I don't know, apparently she didn't want to, I don't know. I actually don't want to speak for her why she took it out. It doesn't make sense. Let's move on to the next meta-analysis, which is the Roman meta-analysis. Now, what's amazing about the Roman, it came out within a month of the other, and they also went through 256 citations. And lo and behold, they came out with the same one that Popp did. Now, Popp's had 14. This had 10, so there's a couple more that she had. But these 10 studies are pretty much all the same, except they added one, and they took away the prevention study. So the one they added was this one, an IE trial, along with the others. And this is actually a study that was a very good study that showed a mortality benefit of ivermectin as compared to placebo. Again, another study showing that ivermectin prevents deaths. And this was very highly clinically significant, 0.001. 99.9% chance that this effect is real, right? And now there's two studies. So I'm sure Roman, unlike Maria Popp, is going to get this right, because now he actually has two clinically significant studies showing mortality benefit. His conclusion, compared with the standard of care placebo, ivermectin did not reduce mortality. What? So again, going through this study, trying to figure out where they're getting this from, it turns out they literally just ripped out the naive and the Ravkirti studies out of the analysis because it had, quote unquote, high risk of bias, a high ROB. It might as well be like an IDLTO. I don't like this one. That high IDL-TO ratio. Because this is nonsense. Like, you don't bring studies into a meta-analysis and then later decide to just rip them out because it doesn't work out for you, right? That's what we call really bad science. But the crazy thing about this is he actually runs the numbers within his study. He actually shows that if you were to include these, you would show an 82% statistically significant decrease in mortality. And shows it in his paper. So the data in his paper shows this, but he actually ends up saying this in his conclusion. Ivermectin did not reduce mortality, but he actually proved that it actually does by the tune of 82%. So, this is my own analysis. It's not something that I've seen anyone talk about. And it's a little bit crazy making because I'm kind of sitting here thinking, does anyone else see this? And I was happy to come across this. It actually was a letter requesting retraction from this study from the very editor from the journal that this was published. So Dr. Shuley, who is the infectious disease attending at University of California, San Diego, which is my alma mater, incidentally. So I happen to know that Dr. Shuley is highly respected. He's a very good infectious disease researcher. And he was as disgusted as I was by this study, and so much so he wrote this open letter. And in this open letter, he comments that the accuracy and integrity are completely lacking and that the conclusions are not defensible on the evidence presented, which is exactly what I was saying. He also points out this apparent irony where the researchers take a moment to complain about misinformation and how that's making it's hard to make decisions and there's political influences. And he, as he states here, this could well serve a summary of this article. It's completely misinformation. He writes in conclusion, disinformation should not be associated with any learned journal and he's respectfully requesting both investigation and retraction of this article. So that's embarrassing. Okay, let's talk about the Together trial. Now, the Together trial may be a real road bump for ivermectin. So far, we've seen substandard studies at best, nothing actually that's shown ivermectin doesn't work. But the Together trial by Dr. Ed Mills may. It has yet to be published. I have not been able to, I don't have the ability to go through and see how they did it and what their data showed. This is a Canadian study, but they actually did it in Brazil. And they actually, on August 6th, they announced preliminary results at a symposium in which Dr. Mills says ivermectin had no effect whatsoever. He also mentioned that the evidence on prophylaxis was weak, but interestingly enough, his study didn't look at prophylaxis. But that aside, there are certain issues that come up with this Together trial that are concerning. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but just to show you, but Dr. Mills, as it turns out, works for Cytel, which is a company that helps Big Pharma get approved by the FDA and push their drugs, and Pfizer is a client. Also, Mills is a clinical trial advisor for Bill Gates, the Bill Gates Foundation. Why is that an issue? Right here, actually, in an interview, he states that the majority of the time I work for a company called Cytel, where I design clinical trials predominantly for Bill Gates. So actually, we're going to talk about that more in a second. The other one I want to point out, though, is this McMaster University. This is where the study was done, and this is where supported. And the other thing I just want to show, McMaster University, also a $12 million beneficiary from Bill Gates. And this actually shows the entire Together trial was actually supported by Bill Gates. So why is this an issue? So Bill Gates, he's a vaccine guy. He's got his blinders on, and it's 100% vaccines. He wants to vaccinate the world. He's put 10 billion in. He's actually put personal stock in it. So he actually has a monetary direct interest in it. And if you want to know what Bill Gates thinks about ivermectin, he's not so crazy about it. This is through his alliance here. And their statement is that absolutely ivermectin has no place in COVID treatment. Okay, fine. And he's entitled to think that. But that's a bias. And, there's a lot of money at stake, $188 billion increase in market value for these vaccine companies. So that sets up a natural conflict. Studies have shown here, when Big Pharma does a study on something, it tends to favor them. So bias is very common. And we have to just realize when you have a Together trial where the vaccine guys are funding the study, it's their guy that's running it who's been an employee, and the institution that it's being run at, he's giving 20-some million dollars to. Okay, so that's all bias, and it makes. So do I know that they're doing a bad study? No, I can't say that. I haven't even seen this study. But I would prefer that this bias not be present when someone's doing a study on ivermectin, because it's going to taint it, whether you like it or not. Incidentally, they didn't disclose a single conflict of interest in the paper protocol. Okay, data in favor of ivermectin. So this all started in Nature, and they published an in vitro study, so it's test tubes, not in people, showing that ivermectin knocked it out of the park. 5,000-fold decrease in RNA within 48 hours. Um, for those interested, I'm going to show you in about 10 seconds how ivermectin works. So this is usually the virus, comes in, spits its little DNA in here, RNA actually, and goes to the factory, makes more copies, and boom, now you have more of the guys. And they go infect other cells. But inside your nucleus, we have an alarm system. It triggers the release of interferon, and interferon, along with other cytokine and chemicals and stuff, and it inhibits this growth and kind of controls it. It usually does pretty good. But this is a very sneaky virus. It actually uses these proteins here to penetrate the nucleus and turn off the alarm. So the cell doesn't know any better. It doesn't produce interferon, and it can really go to town. That's why COVID-19 is so effective. Now, interestingly enough, ivermectin, by happenstance, binds these two proteins, doesn't allow this kind of moiety to be formed, so it can't get through the nucleus. Alarm stays, interferon present, and it allows the cell to protect itself. Now, ivermectin actually has about 6 different or more mechanisms how it works, but these are the 3 most relevant. It does this. Actually, it also stops the virus from attaching, and it also mucks up the factory. So altogether, it's pretty effective. And the other thing I'd like to say here is it makes it actually immune to variants because it's working at so many different places and different mechanisms. So let's look at the studies. The first one that actually came out on this was done in Florida, interesting enough. It's one of the only ones that's been done in the United States. And it was a retrospective study, so looking back, and they noticed, hey, if we use ivermectin, our mortality rate is like much lower, and this was statistically significant. And this is the point at which Merck was supposed to step in and do phase 2 trials based on this, but for mysterious reasons opted out. The number of trials since then, there's probably been about 60, and here are some, and they've largely been actually in favor of ivermectin, almost unanimously. Some have reached clinical significance, others have not. If we looked at the meta-analysis, there's been 5 different meta-analyses done by different groups. The ones, the biggest group was done by Corral, and this included the Mayo Clinic was involved, as well as the Robert Johnson Foundation, among others. And but you could see what's interesting when is the decrease in mortality, how significant it is, varying from as low as 57 as high as 83%, with statistical numbers of p-values that are very, very highly significant. The Hill study in particular was sponsored by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and highly significant results, 0.0002, 75% decrease in mortality. So all of these studies together, it's overwhelming evidence that ivermectin clearly works to decrease deaths and prevent cases by taking it prophylactically. Then there's this. One of the studies that actually was included in the meta-analysis of all of those was this one, the Algazar. Algazar was done in Egypt, and he had 200 patients in the mortality study, 200 patients in a prophylactic study, and as it turns out, he probably did some funny stuff. The Guardian revealed that there was 79 patient records that look cloned from other records. For what it's worth, Algazar says that this was a fake story and it was not the actual raw data, and he plans to defend his work. But before he can say so much, his study got retracted. Now, the media has come to conclude that this study formed a crucial piece of evidence, and its removal destroys the case for using ivermectin. So, and that's reflected in other ones as well. You know, what a big fraud ivermectin is. Now, if we looked at the Algazar effect here, you could just look at the raw numbers. You know, you're talking about going from 15,000 patients to 14,800. 22 to 2000, blah, 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 blah. And you can see actually it wasn't quite as, critical as it may have seemed. There was only 200 patients in the mortality arms. So it actually turns out not to have much of an effect. In fact, um, this was another way to look at it, actually. This shows all the studies that are included, and here's the Algazar, right? And so you're saying strike this one and everything this is discounted. All of this is discounted. Seems like a stretch. But they actually reran all the numbers, looking at the studies, and it turns out removing Algazar did not affect the statistical significance of any of these studies. In the bird group, they actually confirmed as well. That's a group that we're going to talk about in a moment, from Great Britain. Um, and they looked at this and were able to show that ivermectin reduces deaths as well, whether or not you include the Algazar data. And that the Guardian statements about this reversing the findings was completely false. Moving on, these are very interesting studies to me. These are preventative prophylactic studies where what happens is a country like Dominican Republic, they'll give ivermectin out prophylactically to a group of people, and then you'll just see do they get COVID or not, right? So this is a prospectively done study. And in this Dominican Republican one, they did 271 in each group, and very few patients got COVID as compared to almost 7% got COVID here, and it was highly statistically significant, 0.006. Their conclusion was a 74% decrease of COVID cases if they took it prophylactically. India had bigger numbers and even more dramatic effects, where 2% got it versus almost 12. And we're talking about thousands of patients. And they concluded that 83% reduction by taking it preventatively. Argentina was even more dramatic. They had almost 788, almost 800 patients, 400 here. High p-value. No, not even a single patient got COVID out of almost 800 taking it preventatively, whereas almost half the patients got COVID here. So this was a 99.9% reduction in COVID cases in Argentina. And incidentally, they were using a nasal version of ivermectin. Okay, let's look at now epidemiologic evidence. And real quickly, this is what happened in India recently. In March of this year, we could see the cases for the Delta variant, and then here's April, and then here's May, completely exploded. The death count was in India was just absolutely astounding. They accounted for literally half of the entire infections of the entire world. They were having 300,000 a day, their daily case rate. And at the end of it, they had 400,000 deaths during this spike. The state health minister looking at, they were literally piling bodies in fields and burning them because so many people were dying. He was desperate, and he looked around and he noticed that they were using ivermectin in other areas, and there's data supporting it. So he was considering using ivermectin for his country. The WHO came out very strongly and made a statement and encouraged them not to do that. This is this Swaminathan person. Despite that, they went ahead and did it. They gave it to all the adults. And within 10 days, their cases completely plummeted. And when you look at state by state, because a couple of these states decided not to use it, so like for instance, on August 15th, Kerala, which is right here, this little guy, they had 18,000 cases and 100 deaths that day on 8/15. Whereas Delhi or these up here in the north part of India, they had 50 cases, no deaths, 30 cases, 1 death. So it was a drastic difference for the group that did ivermectin versus the ones that did not. And you can see by here, going by state that used it, down 98, down 97, down 90, down 99. It was unbelievable how striking the effect was, adding ivermectin to their national protocol. In Africa, it was a similar phenomena. They showed by adding ivermectin, they were able to get a decrease in cases. Argentina, every time they add ivermectin in a different state in Argentina, they were able to flatten the curve. And then in Peru is interesting because they added ivermectin to their national protocol. We had a new president. He restricted ivermectin, and the case count came up almost to where it was before. And this is more data with Mexico using it. Now, as a result of all these countries and all this data, more and more countries are actually adopting it into like countrywide prophylaxis protocols. And here's a list, and each check mark here is a country that's actually doing it in terms of countrywide adaptation versus the other ones which may be doing something partial, right? So we're approaching 20 countries now that are actually using ivermectin, part of their national protocols to prevent COVID. So the question is, does it work? And there's over 60 case control studies that reach statistical significance in favor of ivermectin for treatment and prevention. So we have plenty of studies showing benefit. We have 5 meta-analyses show benefit both in mortality and prevention with the magic p-values being met. We have prospective studies in the Dominican Republic, India, and Argentina showing that for prophylaxis, they had very consistent results with high p-values as well. And then we have the epidemiologic data from India, Mexico, Argentina, and Peru, and others. The Journal of Antibiotic here in June of 21, they did an analysis of, well, you have all these studies kind of going in the same direction. What's the chance of that? Because 100% of these 17 studies all showed benefit. And the probability that this is by chance and it's not ivermectin that is working is 1 in 23 trillion. So the answer is yes. Ivermectin definitely works, despite what people have been misinforming others as to its potential role for treatment. It clearly does work. Now, safety. Most people think this: ivermectin is for animals and is dangerous. I wonder why they think this. The FDA, if you go on their website, the first thing you see is a horse, and all they do is talk about animals and horses on their site. And they actually post, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, stop it. Okay, so they're making everybody think that ivermectin is for animals and that it's dangerous. Well, the media runs with that because they're taking the lead from the FDA. And here is ivermectin intended for animals, not a treatment, right? The next one, FDA warning: ivermectin meant for animals. So that's what the FDA is intentionally misinforming people, and they've succeeded. In reality, ivermectin, there's 2 versions. There's an animal version and there's a human version, and they're being conflated. So Tylenol also has an animal. There is veterinary Tylenol, and veterinary Tylenol, is dangerous as well for humans. So is veterinary anything. Generally speaking, veterinary drugs should not be taken by humans. So, okay, thanks for letting us know that. But the problem is that the human ivermectin is actually completely safe. And not once has the FDA once ever disputed that. Everything they're talking about is this, and the media and everybody else. So as long as your doctor doesn't hand you a bottle that has an animal on it, you are absolutely good. So 100% safety concerns there, no concerns if you're getting a tablet. So let's look at safety. The WHO guidelines, which when it comes to scabies and ivermectin, they say the side effects are minor and transient. There was a professor who's famous for toxicology. He reviewed 350 articles. Severe adverse events are unequivocally and exceedingly rare. Over the past 30 years, Merck has actually donated 3.7 billion doses of ivermectin over 70 countries to treat river blindness, with very few side effects reported. And annually, they give 300 to 400 million doses as well, ongoing. So for as dangerous as this horse dewormer is, apparently Merck is, we're giving billions of doses away as we speak to countries to treat other things. So I guess it's only dangerous when we're treating COVID, but not treating, river blindness. Um, and there's actually studies showing that even if you increase the maximum recommended dose by 10, it still was safe and no side effects versus placebo. Ivermectin is safer than Tylenol or aspirin and has been prescribed in billions of doses over 40 years. It only became dangerous when Big Pharma saw it as a competitor. I don't know if that's true, but the bottom line is that it is safe, and it always has been safe. And all of a sudden, it's becoming a dangerous horse dewormer, which, quite frankly, is bizarre. So ivermectin, effective, it's safe, it's very inexpensive, and it's now in many countries. So why are we not using it is the question. Government responses now to ivermectin. We start with the FDA. The FDA says data does not show ivermectin is effective. Okay? It's not recommending it. CDC. The CDC says it cautions about the risk of severe illness caused by ivermectin, which was seen in increased cost of poison centers. You would think the CDC would be a little more careful so that they don't misinform or mislead people to say the CDC also cautions about the risk of severe illness with veterinary versions of ivermectin, but they're conflating it. The NIH is interesting, insufficient evidence, either for or against, so they're leaving the door open for doctors to prescribe. The AMA is the worst statement I've ever seen, which says the use of ivermectin for the prevention and treatment of COVID has been demonstrated to be harmful to patients. I would love for the AMA to show me what in the world they're talking about. There's never been a study ever to show that using human dose ivermectin has ever been dangerous in any one study. This is like an absolute misstatement. I don't know who wrote that, but it's wrong, and I would love for them to prove me wrong. This is actually so irresponsible because a lot of people look to the AMA for good information, and this is wrong. And finally, the WHO. And basically they're saying it's just inconclusive, they can't recommend it. Okay, so let's just briefly mention, there are people out there, groups that are formed that look at not just ivermectin, but just alternative treatments to COVID. And this is a big group, the FLCCC. It's a group of critical care doctors, anesthesiologists, pulmonary care, and they're good physicians. I actually reviewed their CVs, and they're well trained. They're good doctors. They're kind of like the real deal guys. They're not crazy anti-vaxxers. In fact, they advocate for the vaccines. But when it comes to ivermectin, they feel that that various panels are severely out of alignment with what we know. The Bird group is a similar kind of group. It's a British group, but they have a panel of like 18 international specialists on it from different countries, and they go through all the data very rigorously, and they came to conclude as well that ivermectin should be recommended for prevention and treatment of COVID. The WHO is running into hot water because, as I showed you earlier, they sponsored a study which showed benefit, and they're basically turning their back on that study and pretending like there's no data on ivermectin. They're actually being sued by the Indian bar because they're accusing Swaminathan for running a disinformation campaign about ivermectin. Okay, so here's the issue. If we don't have enough information, they keep saying, we don't have enough data, then why aren't we studying this? Why is the NIH not studying this? Okay, the total number of studies that have been completed by the NIH now that we're 21 months into this pandemic, 0. No studies have been done on ivermectin. But here they come to save the day with their Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutics Intervention and Vaccines Program, otherwise known as ACTIVE. And this is the NIH looking at what they call repurposing drugs, which means basically non-vaccine alternatives to treating COVID. And Francis Collins is the name of the director of the NIH, had a nice powwow about this recently. But the ideal is to combine public-private programs. That sounds interesting. And when they had this powwow, sitting beside them were all the big pharma guys. And they call this a win-win because big pharma gets to investigate compounds and subsequently, profit from them, and maybe these applications will help patients, which is fine. And Pfizer and the others are all part of this joint venture to study these medications. The other one to mention, Bill and Melinda Gates is also part of this as well. So if we looked at what they came up with their slate of activities and priorities, and I listed these chronologically, starting from October 2020, and as it moves down, you can see every single one of these is a boutique, very expensive, big pharma medication. Okay? Ivermectin is dead last. And the reason, even in their own wording, the reason they added ivermectin was because public and physician belief was that it had clinical benefit. They were literally, peer pressured into adding ivermectin because apparently no one at this table thought it was worth looking at. But in any respects, they put it 9th in their list of priorities. And the pragmatic use of these is kind of questionable because when we're talking about here in a second trying to get vaccine to third world countries and trying to get other treatments to third world countries, something that costs this much is probably not going to be very helpful. And whereas ivermectin could be. So let's look at the ivermectin active 6 arm of this, which is dead last. When are they going to have results for us? March of 2023. That's when their study will be done. So that's what we're waiting for. On that day, when we then will have sufficient data required to satisfy them, we will have been 38 months into the pandemic. Now, so I want to just tie this in this way. These are the roadblocks to ivermectin, and it's the WHO not recommending it. It's this particular trial is probably going to be a big roadblock. And from our own government agencies, the NIH doing the active 6 and pushing it out to March of 2023, the FDA not approving it, and Fauci literally not saying the word ivermectin. And the thing about this is, if you look here, the Gates Foundation, which is representing Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen, in this case, he's funneling $36 billion over 3 years to the WHO. In this case, he's giving $22 million to the university, and he's using his own employee to do the research. And the $1.7 billion going to the government is and being part of this Active 6 program, having, as was revealed in recent emails, having active communications with Fauci directly about their research interest in the focus of future endeavors. You could see here where there may be a problem here. And let me make clear, this is not a problem of Bill Gates. I have no problem with Big Pharma, and I have no problem with Bill Gates, and this is not some kind of conspiracy chart, okay? Because, in fact, kudos to Bill Gates, because he thinks that vaccines is the way to go, and he's doing everything in his power to make that possible. He should be on a beach, sipping on some drink with little umbrellas in it, getting sun, right? But no, he's spending his time meeting with all these people and trying to globally help people from COVID. Kudos to Bill Gates. It's amazing. I have no problem with him. The reason I mention this is to understand, though, that because of his involvement in these activities, it opens the possibility of bias. His worldview starts to become his worldview, right? And his worldview, and his worldview. And that's the problem. His his efforts need to really be kept apart from how we assess ivermectin and implement ivermectin. Because we're going to regret a situation where we finally find that it's effective, but it's too late. So many people, that's actually already the case. To be honest, over 600,000 people have already died in the US. Maybe those lives could have been prevented. But understanding the bias that's present in the system and where it's coming from is important, because you need to sort of recalibrate it and say, okay, it's okay that he has these efforts, no problem, that's great, that's awesome. But these institutions need to be free of that. And if they can't, then these leaders need to be changed. Let's play this out. Fine, we get no ivermectin. Is that the end of the world? The US gets vaccine. It does work great. It's safe. I have no problem with it. So what's the problem? What's so bad about that, Ovalle? Here is the problem, and it's the rest of the world. This is vaccination rates by year, and we're doing great. We're happy. Da, 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 da. It's all good. But as it turns out, the rest of the world, not so good. This is 2022, and then we're hitting 2023 and later. It could be 2025 before we get these countries actually vaccinated. Okay, that's not good. 1.1% of people living in poor conditions are actually vaccinated right now. That's, 2 years almost into this. This is what we're looking at. So the question is it ethical to withhold ivermectin from these poor countries that cannot get vaccinated? Why can't they get vaccinated? Because it's logistically impossible. You have refrigeration issues, transportation issues, right? Aside from purchasing vaccine, right? And then you have staffing issues. It's really, really hard logistically to vaccinate these countries. Number two, are we perpetually allowing variants to develop by not protecting underdeveloped nations? That's the crux of this talk. Every variant we're going to see starts somewhere and spreads like this, on fire. And most of the time it's going to be coming from Brazil, South Africa, places where people are not getting vaccinated. And so we're happy getting vaccinated, but that's a short-lived fantasy, because before long there's going to be another variant coming from this spot in Africa that's going to undermine our immunity, and then it puts us back to square one. So that leads me to the Dr. Ovalle doctrine. The US will not effectively control COVID case counts within its borders until it succeeds in controlling the global infectivity rate. Achieving global protection with a vaccine is not realistic and can be more practically and immediately addressed with ivermectin. They're already using this for things like river blindness, where they're backing the truck and just dumping these pills out and people take them. It's a lot easier than trying to arrange for a vaccine, and it's pretty effective. Okay, so this is much more realistic. These are my recommendations. I recommend the vaccine, Pfizer or Moderna preferably. I recommend the FDA expand indication for ivermectin to include COVID-19 based on all this data we've just shared you. If a person is not willing to get vaccinated, or if they're not able to get vaccinated, I recommend ivermectin used preventatively, and it's usually twice a week, and it's weight-based. Some people use both, and it's probably even better yet protection to do ivermectin maybe twice a week and keep up on your vaccines. I recommend that the active program reprioritize their research endeavors. They need to place ivermectin way above these pharmaceutical boutique drugs, and I think 6 months is reasonable to get results rather than 2023. I recommend the WHO extend approval for ivermectin in light of overwhelming and consistent evidence to begin global distribution program to curb COVID surges and variants. That is their job, actually, is to protect underdeveloped countries. That is their job, and they are completely failing at it. Finally, and I'm going to show you this in a moment, but media pundits need to learn to make a distinction between veterinary versus human ivermectin when referring to toxic effects. And they need to understand studies a little better before they report them. So, the title of this was Ivermectin and Goliath. So who is Goliath? Goliath is not Big Pharma. As I mentioned in this talk already, I don't have a problem with Big Pharma. They have their interests and they have their ways, and we just have to understand that's what they do, but we need to be able to assess ivermectin without that bias and without their worldview affecting the objectivity of what we could potentially do with it, right? So I don't have a problem with that. The Goliath is this. It's misinformation. That's what we fight. And in my exam room, when I talk to people about ivermectin, I have to undo all the misinformation. It is a steep hill to climb every day to have to undo that. Here are some examples.
The latest trend has people using very strong drugs meant for horses. Doctors say this could make you sick or even kill you.
So, given the mountain of evidence that I've presented, as well as the safety profile on a risk-benefit therapeutic analysis, you cannot come up with a credible argument to not give it.
Okay, well, let me just try. It's not been proven safe and effective. It is true that there are people that take it around the world. It's true that there's even a published study or two that shows it suggests it might maybe do something for humans. But there's a process to okay drugs for a reason. And more than 8 months later, we've got farm supply stores that are running out of ivermectin.
Our sources for this story: the Federal Drug Administration, Oregon Health and Science University, and KGW's medical expert, Dr. Pyle Coley. Ivermectin is often used in the U.S. to treat or prevent parasites in animals. The FDA has received multiple reports of people needing medical treatment, of people having to go to the hospital after self-medicating with ivermectin intended for horses.
Let's take a look at this drug. It's called ivermectin. What people need to know about it. First of all, it is growing in terms of rumors circulating on social media about its use specifically for COVID-19 in India. That is not based in reality or fact. It is FDA approved in the United States for treatments of intestinal parasites, so things like roundworms in humans. It's also used regularly in animals in veterinary medicine to prevent parasites, things like heartworm. It is not, I want to emphasize, it is not an antiviral, so its use in unindicated situations, both in humans or in animals, is dangerous and not advised.
Sometimes even the most intelligent people, they get stuck on something. And what doesn't help is the incredible misinformation that the social media propagates. That's the problem. And the best way to counter mis and disinformation is by flooding the system with correct information. So I believe that's one thing that you can do.
You know, it's funny. A common theme in these things is, using the word misinformation, and I don't know how funny it is. It's ironic that these people are actively misinforming people, and yet in the name of preventing misinformation. But it's crazy, right? But they're kind of, they're getting away with it. But anyway, so Fauci's complaining about misinformation, and I agree with him. That is the problem. But we're obviously not agreeing on the source of the misinformation. But it's easy to figure this out because it's about diligence, doing due diligence. And this is a quote from Atul Gawande, who is a surgeon, and he says, people underestimate the importance of diligence as a virtue. Understood that it's a prerequisite for great accomplishment, but it stands as one of the most difficult challenges facing any group of people who take on tasks of risk and consequence. And that's what this is for me. I mean, this is a consequential issue. It's not about gamesmanship or political, leveraging and all these kinds of things. It's because people are dying. There's like a lot of people have died to COVID. Over 500,000 people have died in the United States already, and so as a physician who takes care of people, all I want to do is just best treat my patients and not have them suffer these kind of issues from COVID, especially. So with that in mind, I have to do the due diligence to know what's what. And it appears that the medical leadership, certainly a lot of the people in media, are not doing their due diligence. They're not looking past the summary of a study or the headline of an article. And maybe wherein lies the problem. People are lazy or something. I don't know. But for what it's worth, I feel I've done my due diligence and I've come to my conclusion, which I can, justify, I can explain with source material. And so there you have it. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I know it's a bit of a long talk for the very few of you that probably hung in there for it. But for what it's worth, I hope it helps. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.